The United States should significantly increase its economic and diplomatic relationships with the People's Republic of China. Now, economic relationships are anything in this debate that are pertaining to trade, and diplomatic relationships are anything that relate to foreign domestic issues, etc., etc., etc. But they can include and do include trade. Now, the way this debate is going to be structured is we're going to start out by going through some of our inherencies after a brief introduction, then we're going to move into our harms, then we're going to move into our plan and mandates to solve those. Throughout, we're going to have pieces of evidence showing you how we're going to get this thing done. Now, I'm Logan Rosnick. That's Ben Crash. Without further ado, this is how we're going to do it. Okay. Right now, the relationship we have with China isn't working. The status quo isn't working. In effect, American domestic manufacturing, due to devaluation of Chinese currency, is struggling. Exports are decreasing, and cheap imports from China are pouring into the country, therefore causing competition between manufacturers and shutting down American businesses. Now to our first inherencies. First, the World Trade Organization is an international institution in which we negotiate agreements to reduce barriers to trade with 134 different members, supposedly allowing American businesses, farmers, and workers to expand and to find new business opportunities. Now, what's happening right now is this thing called dumping, is where Chinese companies are dumping imports into American businesses and companies. Now, dumping is when they sell a product in the United States for cheaper than what the domestic product is currently selling at, therefore causing unnecessary competition and shutting businesses down. Now, the inherency part is that the WTO agreement does not regulate the actions of companies engaged in dumping. It's focused on how governments can or cannot react to dumping. It disciplines anti-dumping actions, and in effect, it's called the anti-dumping agreement. Effective because there is a lack of enforcement of the WTO to regulate businesses engaged in dumping, and only provisions to clean up the mess afterward, trade wars can possibly erupt. Now, the TPP is one thing that can be instituted in order to fix this problem. And we'll talk about that in the plan. Now, the next one. This is an example of how companies are dumping. See, China right now is using corrosion-resistant steel and dumping it into the industry. Now, the government's put taxes on those items, and right now it's going to cause a trade war because there's no regulation on the businesses dumping, only the amount that we can tax on the companies putting steel into the country. Now, the second inherency is despite the fact that the WTO has regulations in place against protectionist subsidies, the WTO has no provisions or policies mentioning or even labeling a country as a currency manipulator. Now, this is a major problem. The inherency is that there's no outside negotiation or WTO address in order to address this current harm, inherent harm in the status quo. Now, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, it lacks the authority to address currency manipulation and current status quo policies. But the WTO doesn't address it, even though they have the authority. So one of the two things needs to be changed, or an outside agreement needs to be implemented. Now, the third inherency is the first issue to address is how the People's Republic of China is actively and unfairly protecting its home markets by cutting off and restricting American exports, therefore hurting American manufacturing and companies. Now, China has a long history of exchanging American innovation and technology for limited access to China's markets. This is a provision that is certainly not a bilateral agreement, one that we should strive for to be bilateral, but must be included with an economic plan with China. Now, protectionist policies, unclear regulatory requirements, and a growing sense that foreign companies are unwelcome prevent American companies from expanding into the market. Furthermore, Chinese legislature has imposed discriminatory policies that require the United States to surrender intellectual properties in order to get this market access. There's a lack of policy in the WTO agreements or IMF agreements, or no outside regulation that is putting us in a place where we can access China's markets. There needs to be. That's our plan. Now, these unclear regulatory requirements are seen through nationally adopted national security laws and legislation that China is currently imposing, and it needs to change. So our first harm, and this is a biggie, okay? So as of today, November 6, 2016, yesterday, the United States' total debt is exceeding $19 trillion. The total trade deficit with the world is exceeding $730 trillion and growing, according to the U.S. debt clock. Now, the United States national debt has not hit a critical point, but it will. Eventually, if the trade deficit continues to rise and the national debt continues to rise, foreign investors may begin questioning the United States as a safe bet to invest their money and resources. The economy is stagnant. Outsider investors will soon realize this fact. What may happen as a result is a short-term capital outflow that will dramatically go up, causing money supply to go down, and the government is struggling to find funds and ways to keep the government afloat. What they'll begin doing is stealing people's assets and hard-earned monies, just like they did in the 1920s and 1930s during the Great Depression. Actually, FDR imposed a policy, an executive order, that actually prevented people from hoarding gold or any other hard capital merchandise. And so what that prevented people from doing is it stole people's assets from them. They could go ahead and buy assets, but the government's going to take them away because they need money because of the tremendous debt and trade deficits that they're racking up because of current policies and the status quo. Now, one moment, lots of papers. Here's our mandate one. This is what our plan is going to be. First off, we're going to work through the TPP and bilateral investment treaties, and we're going to also make some adjustments to the WTO provisions. A bilateral investment treaty must be brought to the table between the United States and China. It must include the following: a provision to disable market restrictions through domestic legislature in either country, allowing for safe, unrestricted market access between China and the United States. New restrictions and protections on the intellectual properties of investors seeking access into foreign markets. This will allow for the safe investment of goods and services into an unrestricted market with the foreign economy. Now, the TPP will contain negotiations and provisions similar to that of the BIT. These will include open market and areas of investment in new technologies. It will also contain provisions that will allow for the identification and punishment of currency manipulation. To do this, legal definition of currency manipulation must be placed into what is considered an illegal subsidy by a foreign government, which is already a WTO provision. So we're extending what currency manipulation is to the WTO. Now, for funding. For the United States, there will be little to no cost to enact the BIT and TPP agreements. Most of all the regulations and policies within the agreements are meant for China and other currency manipulators. Economic and diplomatic containment. For this reason, there will be a cost to China as it rearranges its economy to form the new TPP agreements. In terms of administration, this is an international agreement, so the trade departments and executives of all nations, including the United States, must oversee the following transactions, as was happening today. The Secretary of State played a major role in inviting and administrating the TPP to other countries. Enforcement. The agreement requires sensibility and understanding among those involved within the negotiations. After the treaty is enacted, the national legislature within either country's economy will now need to work to adjust their current economic state to one that's outlined with the regulatory regulations included by the TPP. Now, FIAT. The affirmative team claims the right to legislate with intent and to hold the right to clarify. So if we enact a policy, or we're assuming a policy is going to be enacted, we think if we're offering a proposal, we're assuming it's going to be enacted. Now, China is ripping us off on trade, and they're stealing our jobs, right? It's our devaluating the currency, restricting market, and restricting their market access to protect their domestic markets, is what China's doing, is manipulating the currency to protect the domestic markets. They need to stop this protectionist economy, and if things don't change quickly and some resolves be offered, there will be an economic collapse.